A night of joy takes an unexpected turn when an innocent birthday celebration spirals into chaos at an upscale restaurant. Laughter turns into whispers, and a call for dessert becomes a call for something far more serious. But when a powerful figure walks through the doors, the entire room holds its breath. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Jasmine Bennett adjusted the silver sash draped over her shoulder. The words "Birthday Queen" shimmering under the warm glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. She had picked this place months ago, a sleek, upscale venue known for its gourmet cuisine and classy ambiance. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Her best friend, Tasha Reynolds, leaned in close, nudging her playfully. "Girl, you're really 30 now. You feel old yet?" Jasmine scoffed, flipping a curl over her shoulder. "Excuse you, I feel distinguished." The table erupted in laughter. The restaurant was packed, yet their corner felt like its own world. Wine glasses clinking, voices overlapping in cheerful chatter, plates arriving in elegant presentations. It was everything Jasmine had wanted. An intimate yet lively gathering of her closest people, celebrating another year of life, success, and sisterhood. Waiters wove through tables with practiced precision, balancing trays of entrees and cocktails. The scent of grilled steak, buttered lobster, and truffle risotto filled the air. A soft jazz tune played from unseen speakers, adding a touch of sophistication to the evening. Jasmine's younger cousin, Malik, was mid-story about some workplace drama when a shadow loomed over the table. "Excuse me." The voice cut through the laughter like a blade, sharp and unwelcoming. Greg Whitman, the restaurant's manager, stood with a stiff expression, hands clasped in front of him like a disciplinary schoolteacher. Jasmine blinked up at him, momentarily thrown off by the interruption. "Is there a problem?" she asked, maintaining a polite but firm tone. Greg's gaze flicked around the table before settling on Jasmine. "We've received a few complaints from other guests about disturbances coming from this table." Tasha snorted, loud enough for him to hear. "You mean laughter? In a restaurant?" Jasmine set her glass down slowly. "We're just celebrating. We're not being disrespectful or disruptive." Greg shifted on his feet. "Nonetheless, we strive to maintain a certain atmosphere here and—" Before he could finish, a waiter appeared with a tray carrying a 3-tiered chocolate cake, sparklers flickering atop it. The sight should have been a moment of joy. Instead, the tension at the table had already sunk its claws in deep. Jasmine exhaled, forcing herself to remain composed. "So, let me get this straight. You're coming over here right now, when my birthday cake is literally in front of me, to tell us we're disturbing the atmosphere?" Greg pursed his lips. "I'm simply doing my job, ma'am." The term dripped with condescension. Jasmine caught the subtle shift in his expression, the way his eyes barely hid the contempt behind his forced professionalism. She'd seen it before, countless times. Tasha folded her arms. "So, what? Are you asking us to leave? Because unless we're breaking an actual rule, I don't see why you're here." A couple at a nearby table stole glances in their direction, sensing the rising tension. Greg sighed dramatically, as if he were the victim in all of this. "Look, I'm just letting you know that this is a fine dining establishment, not a nightclub." Jasmine's nails pressed into her palm. There it was. The dog whistle. The implication. She glanced around the restaurant, eyes scanning the other patrons, mostly white, all engaged in lively conversations, drinks flowing, laughter bubbling just as freely, but their joy wasn't being policed. "Interesting," Jasmine said, voice steady but cool, "because I hear plenty of noise in this restaurant. I see plenty of tables laughing and talking, but we're the only table you've come to." Greg's face twitched, his composure cracking just slightly. "I'm not—" "No, let's be real," Jasmine cut in, tilting her head. "What exactly makes our table a disturbance?" The tension thickened. Greg cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you don't lower your voice, I'll have to ask you to leave. Tasha's chair scraped back. You've got to be kidding me. Malik, always the peacemaker, held up a hand. All right, we don't need a scene. We're just here to celebrate, man. Jasmine inhaled through her nose, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Greg, we'll keep the atmosphere in mind, but we're not going anywhere. He hesitated, as if debating whether to push further. Then, with a tight nod, he turned on his heel and walked away. The table sat in stunned silence for a beat. Tasha leaned in, lowering her voice. You know what that was, right? Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she picked up the cake knife and began slicing. Let's eat. But the celebration was already tainted. Minutes later, as the cake plates were being passed around, the murmured conversations at the table struggled to find their previous warmth. The moment had left a bitter taste. Then, just as Jasmine took a bite of her cake, the air shifted again. A new presence approached. But this time, it wasn't Greg. It was a police officer, and he was walking straight toward their table. Jasmine's fork hovered over her plate, the rich chocolate of the birthday cake suddenly tasting like ash in her mouth. The officer approaching their table had the kind of presence that made the air feel colder, despite the restaurant's warm lighting. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. Every step he took toward them seemed to stretch time. Good evening, the officer said, his voice smooth but authoritative. His nameplate read Miller. We received a call from management about a disturbance at this table. A hush fell over the group. Tasha's jaw tightened. Malik, usually the easygoing one, set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Jasmine, heart pounding, forced herself to meet his gaze directly. A disturbance, she repeated slowly. Officer Miller gave a nod, flipping open a small notepad. The manager reports that there were complaints about excessive noise and disruptive behavior. Jasmine's lips parted in disbelief. She glanced around the restaurant, at the clusters of diners sipping wine and laughing freely. No one else seemed to be getting visits from the police. Her voice came out measured but firm. Officer, we're a birthday party. We've been talking and laughing, just like every other table here. Is that illegal now? Officer Miller hesitated. No, ma'am, but the manager has the right to call us if he believes a situation is getting out of hand. Tasha let out a sharp laugh. Out of hand? You've got to be joking. The officer's eyes flicked toward her. Ma'am, I just need to confirm that everything is okay here. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists under the table. We were fine until the manager decided to single us out. Malik exhaled, rubbing his temples. Man, this is crazy. We're just trying to enjoy a meal. Tasha, never one to back down, leaned forward, her voice laced with sarcasm. I wonder how many other birthday parties Greg called the police on tonight, because from where I'm sitting, I see a whole lot of noise in this restaurant, but no other tables getting interrogated. Officer Miller's lips pressed together. It was clear he wasn't looking for trouble, but he also wasn't about to backpedal in front of a room full of onlookers. People were watching now. Conversations had quieted. Eyes darted toward their table, some filled with curiosity, others with that all-too-familiar mix of discomfort and silent judgment. Jasmine exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. Officer, you see what this is, right? You see that this isn't about a disturbance. It's about us being seen as the problem. A flicker of something crossed Officer Miller's face. Understanding, maybe, or hesitation. But before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Greg had returned, standing just a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was neutral, but Jasmine saw the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He had done this on purpose. Officer Miller turned to him. You're the one who called this in? Greg nodded. I tried to handle it myself, but they were getting aggressive. I have to think about the experience of my other guests. Jasmine's breath hitched. Aggressive. The word felt like an electric shock to her spine. What exactly did we do that was aggressive? Greg shrugged, playing up his innocent act. You raised your voice, and I felt uncomfortable. This is a fine dining establishment. I run a certain kind of place. Jasmine stared at him, heat rising in her cheeks. A certain kind of place. She knew exactly what he meant. Officer Miller sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He didn't seem thrilled to be part of this, but that didn't mean he was going to shut it down either. He looked at Jasmine again. Ma'am, if the management is asking you to leave. Tasha slammed her hand on the table. You cannot be serious. The officer held up a hand. Look, I'm not here to escalate this, but the manager has the right to refuse service. I need you to cooperate. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay composed. Everything inside her screamed to fight back, to refuse, to make this man say out loud what he was really doing. But she also knew how these situations could spiral. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Slowly, she reached for her purse. Fine, we'll leave. Tasha whipped her head around. Jasmine, it's not worth it, she murmured. Malik stood, shaking his head. Man, this is ridiculous. The group rose to their feet, collecting their belongings, the festive energy of the night completely drained. Around them, people pretended not to stare, but the weight of their attention pressed down like a lead blanket. Some looked away in awkwardness, others leaned in, fascinated by the unfolding spectacle. Jasmine turned to Greg, her voice even. I hope this was worth it. Greg didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already won. Officer Miller took a step back, giving them space to leave. But just as Jasmine started walking, something inside her rebelled. No, this wasn't going to end like this. She pulled out her phone, tapping quickly into her contacts. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice picked up. Jasmine turned, locking eyes with Greg as she spoke into the phone. Hey, sis, I need you to come down to this restaurant real quick. Greg's smug expression flickered with something else. Jasmine saw it, and she smiled. Greg Whitman had seen plenty of entitled customers in his years managing this restaurant. He prided himself on keeping the place elegant, upscale, and most importantly, the right kind of environment. That meant people who knew how to act, how to follow the unspoken rules, and how to leave their so-called grievances at the door. And yet, as Jasmine Bennett and her friends reluctantly made their way toward the exit, something felt different. There was a finality to it, sure, but there was also an unease that Greg couldn't shake. The way Jasmine had smiled at him after making that phone call. It wasn't the smile of someone who had lost. It was the smile of someone waiting for a storm to roll in. Jasmine walked slowly, intentionally. Tasha was fuming, Malik was shaking his head, and the rest of their group was caught somewhere between silent disbelief and outright anger. The entire restaurant had become an audience to their humiliation, though most pretended to be absorbed in their meals. A few whispered, a couple glanced away in discomfort, but none of them spoke up. None of them had to. Outside, the valet barely made eye contact as he retrieved their cars. The city air was thick with summer humidity, making the whole scene feel even heavier. Jasmine's fingers clenched around her phone, her pulse still racing. She wasn't letting this go. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver barely had time to shift into park before the back door swung open. A woman in a neatly pressed uniform stepped out, the glint of her badge catching the light as she adjusted the holster at her hip. She moved with precision, with authority, with the kind of presence that turned heads before she even spoke a word. Captain Naomi Bennett. Jasmine exhaled, her spine straightening as her older sister's gaze swept over the scene. Naomi wasn't just any cop. She wasn't some patrol officer responding to a call. She was the captain. High-ranking, respected, the kind of officer who made others fall in line just by existing in the same space. She wasn't just here to check in. She was here to make a statement. Her boots clicked against the pavement as she stepped forward. She took in the tension in Jasmine's jaw, the restrained fury in Tasha's stance, the way Malik's fists flexed like he was barely keeping himself from punching something. "What happened?" Naomi's voice was calm, but Jasmine knew her well enough to hear the warning beneath it. Greg had stepped outside, standing near the entrance with the smugness of a man who believed he had already won. But the moment his eyes landed on Naomi's uniform, something in his posture shifted. Jasmine didn't bother sugarcoating it. "We were celebrating my birthday. The manager over there didn't like how we were disturbing the atmosphere. He called the cops, told them we were aggressive." Naomi's head tilted slightly. "Aggressive?" Greg took a step forward, clearing his throat. "Captain, I assure you, this has nothing to do with—" Naomi's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "I don't recall speaking to you." Greg shut his mouth so fast Jasmine almost laughed. Officer Miller was still lingering nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. He had his hands on his belt, shifting awkwardly as he realized the situation had completely flipped. Naomi finally acknowledged him. "You the responding officer?" "Yes, ma'am." "You see any crime being committed?" "No, none." "Any reason my sister and her friends needed to be escorted out of this establishment?" Officer Miller hesitated. He wasn't a bad cop. He knew what this was, but he also wasn't about to throw the manager under the bus too quickly. "The manager called us in, said there was a disturbance." Naomi cut him off. "And you arrived, assessed the situation, and determined what, exactly?" Miller's jaw clenched slightly. "That, there, was no actual threat." Naomi's eyebrows lifted. "No actual threat, and yet my sister and her guests were still asked to leave." Miller said nothing. Greg took that as his moment to step in. "Captain, I was simply maintaining the integrity of my establishment. We cater to a certain clientele, and—" "We?" Naomi's head tilted again. "Go ahead," she said, her voice dangerously smooth. "Finish that sentence." Greg faltered, realizing too late that he had walked directly into a trap. Naomi turned back to Miller. "Did you run their IDs?" Miller shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Did you have any reason to believe they were a threat to public safety?" "No, ma'am." Naomi let the silence stretch for a beat before she turned fully toward Greg. "So, let me get this straight. You called the police, wasted department resources, and embarrassed paying customers because you didn't like the way they were existing in your space?" Greg's face reddened. "That's not what I suggest you choose your next words carefully," Naomi said. The doors to the restaurant opened again. A sharply dressed man in his late 50s stepped out, his expression tight with concern. He was older, balding slightly, with a type of air that suggested he didn't often involve himself in the daily operations of the restaurant. "The owner?" Greg visibly tensed. The man's eyes flicked between Naomi, Greg, and the watching officers before settling on Jasmine. "I'm Richard Vaughn. I own this restaurant. Is there a problem?" Naomi didn't even have to answer. Officer Miller took it upon himself. "Your manager called us on a group of paying customers," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "No laws were broken. No disturbances were found." Richard's expression darkened as he turned to Greg. "Is that true?" Greg swallowed hard. I was just trying to maintain the experience we promise our patrons." Richard's eyes narrowed. "By calling the police on a birthday party?" Jasmine crossed her arms. "Oh, but we were a disturbance." Richard exhaled sharply. "Greg, inside, now." Greg hesitated, but one look at Richard's face sent him scurrying through the doors. Naomi took a step back, watching as the man disappeared. Richard turned back to Jasmine. "I sincerely apologize for what just happened. That is not how we conduct business here. I'd like to make it right." Jasmine met his gaze. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Richard hesitated before clearing his throat. Your meal is on the house, and Greg will no longer be an issue. Jasmine wasn't sure if he meant fired or just handled in some other way, but frankly, she didn't care. Naomi turned to her, her voice softer now. You good? Jasmine nodded. Yeah, I am now. Richard nodded once before disappearing back inside, leaving the tension to settle on the pavement. Tasha let out a breath, shaking her head. Whew, that was satisfying. Malik grinned. I don't think Greg's making it to his next shift. Jasmine turned to Naomi, gratitude swelling in her chest. Thanks for coming. Naomi smirked. You know I love a good power move. The night had started as a celebration, turned into a nightmare, and somehow ended on a high note. Jasmine looked up at the restaurant one last time before exhaling. This birthday would definitely be one to remember. The tension outside the restaurant finally started to dissolve, leaving only the lingering embers of what had just happened. The night air carried a quiet hum of relief, the weight of unspoken truths still hanging between Jasmine and her friends. But there was something else, too. Something lighter, something victorious. Jasmine let out a slow breath, looking at her sister. Naomi stood with her hands on her hips, her badge still gleaming under the restaurant's entrance lights. There was a quiet confidence about her, like she had seen this all before, like she knew exactly how it would play out from the moment she stepped out of that SUV. Jasmine gave her a knowing look. You enjoyed that, didn't you? Naomi smirked, just a little. Tasha finally exhaled, rolling her shoulders like she was physically shaking off the weight of it all. Well, that was something. Malik let out a short laugh. I knew it was going to go left the second Greg started talking about maintaining the atmosphere. He deepened his voice in mock seriousness. This is a fine dining establishment. Jasmine snorted. Oh, that man thought he had us. Tasha scoffed, until Captain Bennett walked in like the grim reaper of racists. Naomi chuckled. It's a talent. Jasmine shook her head, a smirk forming. The anger was still there, but now it was coated in something else, a sense of satisfaction. The night hadn't gone as planned, but at least it hadn't ended in the kind of disaster Greg had been hoping for. A thought struck her, and she turned to Naomi. You really think he's fired? Naomi shrugged. Maybe not tonight, but give it a week. Nobody likes bad press. Malik's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen before grinning. Oh, he's fired. Somebody in the restaurant just put it on Twitter. Manager calls cops on black birthday party, but gets checked by a black female police captain. Tasha's eyes widened. Wait, for real? Malik turned his phone so they could see the post. A blurry photo of Naomi standing in uniform outside the restaurant was already racking up likes and retweets. The comments section was a mix of outrage, praise, and some good old-fashioned internet roasting. Jasmine laughed. Well, there goes his career in hospitality. Naomi smirked but kept her voice even. He did it to himself. They stood there for a moment, basking in the victory. It wasn't often that things played out like this. Too many times people like Greg got away with their quiet discrimination, their barely veiled contempt disguised as policies and rules. But tonight the tables had turned. Jasmine turned back to Naomi. You sticking around, or do you have to get back? Naomi glanced at her watch. I can stay for a bit. Malik grinned. Good. Because we are not ending this night on that note. Tasha nodded. Absolutely not. Birthday girl, where to? Jasmine thought for a moment, then a slow smile crept onto her face. You know what? There's a late-night spot down the street, nothing fancy. Good music, good drinks, zero racist managers. Tasha pumped a fist in the air. Now that's the energy we need. Naomi arched an eyebrow. You sure you're up for more tonight? Jasmine gave her a look. You think Greg and his nonsense is going to ruin my 30th? She shook her head. Absolutely not. Malik grinned. That's what I'm talking about. They piled into their cars, leaving the restaurant and its drama behind them. The city streets stretched ahead, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, the hum of nightlife still buzzing in the air. The tension from earlier melted with each passing block, replaced by the rhythm of something new, something joyful. The late-night lounge was exactly what they needed. Low lighting, a DJ spinning classic R&B, the scent of fried food wafting through the air. The place was packed, but in a way that felt inviting, not suffocating, the kind of crowd that swayed to the music instead of shuffling nervously in their seats. They found a table near the bar, Jasmine at the center like a queen reclaiming her night. Drinks arrived. Naomi stuck to club soda, ever the responsible one, but Tasha had a margarita in each hand before the server even walked away. The music pulsed through the room, laughter spilling across the table as the group settled back into their natural rhythm. At some point, Malik disappeared onto the dance floor, immediately caught up in the energy of the place. Tasha cackled as he spun an older woman in a red dress, both of them dramatically two-stepping like they were at a family barbecue. Jasmine leaned back, exhaling slowly. Naomi caught the shift in her expression. "You good?" Jasmine nodded. "Yeah. I think I just needed to breathe." Naomi studied her. "I know tonight didn't go how you planned." Jasmine huffed a laugh. "Understatement." "But," Naomi continued, "you handled it." Jasmine tilted her head. "You handled it." Naomi smirked. "Yeah, well, you knew exactly who to call." Jasmine grinned. "Of course I did." They clinked glasses, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them. Tasha slid back into her seat, shaking her head at Malik's antics. "Okay, but this might be the best birthday story ever." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Ooh? You think I wanted my night to involve cops and a racist manager?" Tasha shrugged. "No, but I do think that years from now, you're going to tell this story at every gathering and people are going to eat it up." She mimicked an old lady's voice, holding an invisible glass of wine. "Lemme tell y'all about the time a restaurant tried to kick me out, but my big, bad police captain's sister shut it all the way down." Jasmine burst into laughter. "Stop." Tasha smirked. "You know I'm right." Jasmine shook her head, still laughing. "Fine, but next year I'm picking a place where I don't need to call backup." Naomi sipped her drink, amused. "Probably a good idea." The night stretched on, filled with music, with joy, with the kind of warmth that made the earlier chaos feel like a distant memory. The restaurant incident might have stained the night for a moment, but it hadn't defined it. Jasmine had walked away with her head high. And now, she was celebrating exactly the way she wanted to, surrounded by her people, wrapped in laughter, owning the moment. 30 never looked so good.